3 weeks ago, I was standing on a familiar dirt path that led to the lake just behind my property, fishing pole in hand, cooler over my shoulder when I saw it. A brand new wrought iron gate welded right into the walking trail. A sign hung from the middle. Private access residents with HOA permit only. Permit? I was a resident, been one for 5 years. My house backed right up to that lake. I'd fished there. My son had learned to skip stones there. It was practically part of my yard. What the hell is this? I muttered. A voice like a crow in heat chirped from behind me. That's HOA property now. Only authorized members can use the lake, came the nasal whine of Lorraine Matthews, the HOA president. Lorraine was the type of woman who wore pastel cardigans like armor and treated bylaws like scripture. She was always walking around with a clipboard like it was a badge. She was standing there in her usual tennis outfit, holding her little mutt that looked like it hated her as much as I did. Lorraine, I live right there. My back fence is 15 feet from this gate, I said, pointing toward my house. Yes, well, Spencer, the board voted to restrict lake access to reduce unmonitored usage. You'll need to submit a request form and pay the annual lake permit $200, she said, smiling like she was offering me a deal at a car lot. You're charging me to access the lake I live next to? It's not your lake, she said, flipping her clipboard. It's HOA property now. We negotiated a lease with the landowner last month. It's all legal. My blood started to boil. You're telling me you leased the lake from old Mr. Callahan? That's right. He agreed to let the HOA manage it exclusively. He's too old to deal with it anymore anyway, she said, then turned and walked off like she'd just mic dropped her way off a stage. I didn't say another word. I just stood there fuming, watching her disappear around the bend with her yapping dog. That same night, I drove straight to Callahan's place. He was 92, half-deaf, and still sharper than anyone gave him credit for. You didn't sell them the lake, I asked him. Nope, just agreed to let him maintain it. They pay me a few hundred a year. Fine by me, he said, sipping his tea. Would you be willing to sell it? Callahan blinked at me. You serious? I nodded. Dead serious. He leaned back in his chair and stared out the window toward the lake. You love it that much? My son learned to swim there. I'm not gonna let some clipboard queen gate it off like it's her private pool. Callahan chuckled. All right, son. Let me get my paperwork. 2 days later, I owned the lake, not just the water, but the shoreline, the trails, the trees. Everything Lorraine claimed to manage was now mine. And I had plans. Big ones. The paperwork went through faster than I expected. Callahan's lawyer was semi-retired but efficient. I paid in full, no financing, no loopholes, just a clean transfer of ownership. The lake, every inch of shoreline, and the surrounding acre and a half of wooded trail was now deeded under my name. By the following Monday, I had a fresh private property, no trespassing sign staked into the dirt just behind the iron gate. I didn't remove the gate. I didn't touch their sign. I simply added mine larger, cleaner, backed by law. Then I filed a cease and desist against Lakeside Meadow HOA for unauthorized use of private land. 2 days after that, I got a knock on my door. It was Brandon Hayes, the HOA's treasurer, looking like he'd just swallowed a lemon whole. He was wearing a blazer 2 sizes too small and holding a manila folder like it might explode. Can we talk? He asked, shifting awkwardly on the porch. I let him in but didn't offer him a seat. We'd like to resolve this amicably, he began, opening the folder and sliding a document onto my kitchen table. There's been a misunderstanding. The HOA believed the land was public or at least under cooperative lease. We didn't realize. Cut the nonsense, I interrupted. You knew exactly what you were doing. You gambled that Callahan wouldn't care and no one would challenge it. Well, now it's mine. We're prepared to offer a partnership, he said, gesturing to the folder. The board approved a shared access agreement. We maintain the area, you grant community access, and in return we'll pay a small maintenance fee. No, Brandon blinked. Excuse me. You heard me. The community doesn't get free access to my land, not after Lorraine locked me out of it and tried to charge me for it. He leaned back, clearly rattled. Then, what exactly do you want? I pulled out my own folder. Simple. The HOA wants to use the lake, fine, you'll need a water usage lease. Which means you'll pay me for every gallon you draw for irrigation, landscaping, or recreational amenities. I've already had the land surveyed and confirmed your sprinkler systems for the walking trails and common grounds pull from the lake's groundwater basin. That makes it my water now. His face turned pale. That's not how it works. You can't just, I've already filed with the county, you'll have to negotiate a utility rights agreement or shut down every spigot that draws from the lake. He started to protest, but I wasn't done. I've also contacted the Department of Environmental Quality. Turns out the HOA's been using unpermitted fertilizer runoff near the lake edge. That's a state-level violation. Brandon stood there, frozen, lips parted but silent. Here's my offer, I said, sliding my lease proposal across the table. $2,000 per month for water rights. That includes irrigation and aesthetic use. No recreational access. Violations will be met with legal action. He didn't take the paper, just stared at it like it might bite him. Lorraine isn't going to like this, he finally muttered. I crossed my arms. Tell her to read the deed. He left without taking the folder. By the weekend, the HOA had stopped watering their trails. The flowers at the entrance started to wilt. The fountains at the clubhouse sputtered and died. And the walking trail lights powered by a pump system that ran near the lake flickered out by Sunday evening. Then came the emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't have to be. My neighbor, Gloria, lived across from the community center and had a full view through their open blinds. She called me the next morning. They were yelling, she whispered over the phone. Lorraine was red in the face, said you were extorting them. She tried to fence off my backyard. Yeah, well, there's more. Turns out they've been listing the lake in their promotional materials for years. It's on the website, the brochures, even the real estate listings. Which meant realtors had been advertising access they legally didn't have. That gave me an idea. I contacted the local real estate licensing board and submitted a claim regarding false advertising of community amenities. I attached screenshots from the HOA's website, brochures, and listings from the past 3 years, all boasting exclusive lake access. 3 days later, I got a call from a licensing investigator named Nina. She sounded intrigued. If what you're saying is true, that's a serious violation, she said. Advertising an amenity that isn't legally available to all residents, that can impact home values and lead to license suspensions. I sent her everything. Deed, time-stamped photos, correspondence with the HOA, even the original lease agreement Callahan signed. She promised to escalate it. Meanwhile, Lorraine doubled down. I came home one afternoon to find a stack of envelopes taped to my front door. Fines. Unauthorized signage. Violation of community aesthetic. Non-compliant land usage. Every single one had the HOA letterhead. Every single one was bogus. I didn't even take them off the door. I took photos and emailed them directly to my lawyer, a buddy from college who owed me a favor after I covered for him during a messy divorce. Let them keep digging, he said. The more paper they throw at you, the worse they look when this hits court, but it never made it that far. Because 2 weeks later, something happened that cracked the whole thing open. A former board member named Jeremy emailed me. He'd moved out of the neighborhood 6 months prior, but had kept tabs on the HOA drama for fun. I saw your name come up on the HOA Facebook group, he wrote. I've got something you'll want to see. He sent me a PDF. It was a scanned copy of an internal HOA memo dated 6 months earlier. It outlined a strategic acquisition plan to lease and eventually purchase the surrounding land, including the lake, under a shell LLC tied to Lorraine's husband's law firm. And the worst part? They'd already collected over $30,000 in special assessment fees from residents, claiming it was for clubhouse renovations. But according to this memo, it had been earmarked for the land lease deal all along. I forwarded the memo to my lawyer. then to the county fraud department. Within 4 days, the HOA office was served a subpoena. Turns out Lorraine hadn't just misled the community, she'd orchestrated a full-blown embezzlement scheme. The lease payments to Callahan had come from HOA funds, but the LLC on the paperwork was registered to a dummy corporation based out of her cousin's address in Phoenix. The fraud unit froze the HOA's accounts pending investigation. Lorraine was arrested at her home the following week for misappropriation of funds and wire fraud. Brandon was questioned but released. The rest of the board resigned within days. Residents were furious. Not at me, at the people who'd been bleeding them dry while pretending to trim shrubs and police mailbox paint. A special vote was held to dissolve the HOA entirely, and it passed, unanimously. A month later, the gate came down. The signs were removed. The trails were reopened, but only to those I granted permits to, and just for fun, I put up a new sign at the edge of the lake. Private property. Access granted by owner only. Former HOA board members need not apply. The first full month after the HOA collapsed felt like shedding a weighted vest I didn't know I'd been wearing. Neighbors who used to glance away now waved from their porches. Some even brought over pie like we were in a Norman Rockwell painting. People were starting to breathe again. The fear of being fined for letting their kids draw chalk on the sidewalk or forgetting to edge their lawn once was finally gone. But the mess Lorraine left behind didn't wash away with her arrest. The deeper the county dug into her shell corporation, the worse it got. Apparently, she'd filed fake invoices for landscape work that never happened and redirected funds through a fictitious vendor registered under her niece's maiden name. A forensic accountant was assigned to the case. I knew that because they contacted me not as a witness, but as the property owner tied to the original lease. "You're the only person who holds a clean title in this whole disaster," the investigator told me over coffee at the diner down the road. This HOA didn't just bend the rules. They cut them up and set them on fire. Meanwhile, the former treasurer Brandon quietly put his house up for sale. I caught him loading boxes into a rental truck one morning. He didn't notice me at first, but when he did, he froze. "You running from the smell, or is the fire spreading?" I asked, leaning on my mailbox. "I didn't know about the shell company," he said, eyes darting like a cornered animal. "She handled all of it." "I just signed the checks." "You signed off on a $30,000 assessment and didn't ask where it was going." "I was told it was for a new clubhouse roof." She even showed me a quote. "And you didn't notice when no contractors showed up for 3 months." He shut the truck door a little too hard. "I made mistakes, big ones. I'm just trying to move on." "That's convenient." He climbed into the cab without answering. I watched him drive off, gravel scattering behind his tires. The house stayed empty for weeks before a new couple moved in, a retired firefighter and his wife, who wasted no time asking about the neighborhood's history with the HOA. I told them the truth. They laughed and said they'd dealt with worse in Pittsburgh. But the real turning point came when I got a letter from the state attorney's office. Lorraine had flipped. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she'd started naming names: real estate agents, board members from other HOAs, even a county zoning official who'd approved a variance that allowed her to reroute a drainage system illegally. Apparently, this went far beyond our little lakeside neighborhood. It was a network, one that used HOAs as a front for laundering money through fake maintenance expenses and property improvements that never happened. I was asked to testify, not just as a witness, but as someone who had sparked the investigation. "You're the catalyst," the assistant DA told me during our prep meeting. "Without the land purchase, none of this would have unraveled. You cut the wire they were all hanging on to." I agreed to testify, not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd seen what unchecked power could do to a community. People had been too scared to speak up, too conditioned to avoid conflict, and Lorraine had fed on that like a parasite. The trial was held in a district courthouse 2 counties over to avoid any local bias. When I took the stand, I stuck to the facts. I described the gate, the sign, the bogus permit system, the forged water usage. And then I handed over the copy of the lease agreement, the property deed, and the memo Jeremy had sent me. The defense tried to downplay it all as poor accounting and overzealous management. But the jury didn't buy it. Lorraine was sentenced to 6 years in state prison with no chance of parole for at least 4. Her husband lost his law license. The niece who helped file the fake vendor paperwork was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Total restitution owed to the community was over $120,000. None of it came out of my pocket. Back home, the neighborhood transformed. Without the HOA, residents started organizing informal committees for things like seasonal decorations and neighborhood watch. The oddest part? It worked better than before. Fewer arguments, more collaboration, and not one person tried to reinstate a governing body. I kept control of the lake, but I did something unexpected with it. I built a small dock with 2 benches and opened it for free use on weekends by permission only. No fees, just a sign-up sheet at the community bulletin board. Families came to fish, teenagers brought guitars, and one couple even got engaged out there. The only rule: respect the space or lose access. I never had to revoke it once. Then one afternoon, about 8 months after the trial, a letter arrived in my mailbox, thick envelope. Government seal. I opened it, expecting some follow-up paperwork. Instead, it was a certificate of recognition from the State Department of Consumer Protection. In acknowledgement of your role in helping uncover a multi-layered fraud scheme and restoring transparency to local residential governance. I stared at it for a full minute. Then I laughed. Loud and long. I framed it and hung it in the garage next to my fishing rods. A week later, I was pouring concrete footers for a small boathouse when Gloria from across the street wandered over with lemonade. "You know," she said, watching me smooth the surface with a trowel, "I used to think you were just the grumpy guy who yelled at squirrels." "I am the grumpy guy who yells at squirrels." "Well, maybe. But you're also the guy who saved this place from becoming a gated swamp of bureaucracy." High praise. She handed me the glass and sat on the overturned bucket nearby. "So what now? You running for mayor? Not a chance." "Good. You'd hate the paperwork." We sat there in the late afternoon sun, the lake behind us shimmering like a secret no one could steal again. The trail was open. The flowers were blooming. And the only thing guarding the water was the respect it had earned. Justice didn't come easy. But when it did, it hit like a hammer on steel, and the echoes would last for years. 2 months after the trial, I was ankle-deep in the lake during a quiet Saturday when a man in a Navy windbreaker with a county seal stitched above the pocket stepped onto the dock. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there scanning the shoreline like he was deciding whether to speak or not. When I finally waded out and climbed up, he introduced himself. Detective Alan Greaves, Financial Crimes Division. "I'm guessing this isn't a fishing visit," I said, grabbing a towel off the bench. He didn't laugh. "We've uncovered something new. It concerns the original HOA charter and some forged zoning permits tied to Lorraine's group. You're listed as the current legal owner of multiple affected parcels. We need to walk the perimeter." I nodded, motioned for him to follow the trail that looped behind the dock and cut through a wooded patch. We passed the old concrete basin that used to feed the community's irrigation system. Greaves stopped, pulled out a folder, and handed me a copy of a zoning map. "See these red highlighted sections?" he asked. "They were designated as protected watershed buffers 5 years ago. No structures, no alterations, not even footpaths. But your HOA submitted altered plats claiming they were cleared for utility lines. Was this before or after Callahan leased it out?" "Before. They backdated the approvals. That stormwater collection pit over there." He pointed toward a cluster of buried PVC piping near the trailhead. "It's illegal, never should have been installed. It redirects runoff into a sump pit that leaks into the lake." I stared at the map again. They diverted stormwater into a protected lake and covered it up, he nodded. That's felony-level environmental tampering, and it gets worse. The contractor listed on the permit doesn't exist. The license number belongs to a roofing company in South Dakota. That explained the algae bloom I'd noticed 2 summers ago. It also explained why ducks stopped nesting along the west edge of the lake. They'd poisoned the ecosystem to keep maintenance costs low, Greaves continued. We're opening an environmental fraud case. It'll involve the State Water Board and possibly the EPA. But since you're the owner now, we'll need you to sign off on access for soil testing and water analysis. I agreed without hesitation. Whatever it took to clean this up, I'd make sure it happened. The next week, a crew in hazmat suits set up a decontamination booth near the edge of the woods and started drilling core samples. Residents slowed down to watch, whispering from behind their fences. Gloria brought over folding chairs and lemonade like it was a summer concert. Nobody complained. Not anymore. What they found wasn't just runoff, it was chemical dumping. The HOA had contracted a landscaping service 3 years ago to dispose of herbicide waste. Instead of paying for regulated disposal, they'd buried it along the trail, just uphill from the waterline. It had been seeping into the lake ever since. You're lucky your son didn't swim in here last year, one of the environmental engineers told me. The exposure levels are borderline toxic. I had to step away after that. I didn't want to punch a tree in front of a government employee. The state filed charges against 3 former board members, 2 for environmental violations, and 1 for falsifying public records. Lorraine, already serving time, was added to a new indictment. Her sentence was extended another 4 years. The landscaping company, a shell firm operated from a P.O. box, was shut down permanently. The lake was closed for 6 weeks while remediation crews worked. They installed filtration barriers, siphoned off contaminated groundwater, and dredged a thin layer of sediment from the worst-hit area. The cleanup was costly, but the county agreed to cover it under a public interest restoration grant triggered by the fact that the HOA had falsely registered the lake as public use property in several filings. The irony was bitter. When the lake reopened, it was cleaner than it had been in a decade. The fish returned first, then the birds. The turtles found their way back a week later, sunning themselves on the rocks like nothing had changed, but everything had. A few weeks after that, I was asked to speak at a town hall meeting, not in my neighborhood, in a nearby district that had just voted to form an HOA. The county had asked me to share my story as a cautionary tale. The room was packed. Folding chairs, standing room only. I walked in wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, feeling distinctly out of place among all the business casual. When they handed me the mic, I didn't give a speech. I told them what happened. How a fake permit turned into a locked gate, how a lease turned into a lie. How $30,000 in beautification fees became a criminal enterprise that poisoned a lake and nearly a child. And then I told them the truth that most people don't want to admit. HOAs don't start corrupt. They rot slowly. 1 unchecked signature, 1 quiet vote. 1 neighbor who decides they know better. When I finished, the room was silent. Then a man in the back raised his hand. What would you do differently if you could start over? I looked at him for a moment, then answered. Install cameras, read every document, and never let someone with a clipboard tell you what your home is worth. After the meeting, over a dozen people came up to ask questions. 1 woman wanted to know how I proved the water usage. Another asked about forming a land trust to prevent similar abuse. I gave them everything I had. Copies of filings, names of investigators, the contact info for the environmental team. The county had quietly started training a task force to audit HOA records. They asked me to consult on it. I declined, but I gave them a list of red flags to look for. Lorraine's name was on all of them. Back home, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. People still mowed their lawns and painted their fences, but now it was because they wanted to, not because they feared a letter taped to their door. The bulletin board outside the community center was updated weekly, but it was filled with potluck sign-ups and dog walking schedules instead of warnings and citations. The lake stayed private, but I kept the weekend permit system alive. Kids came to fish with their grandparents. Couples brought wine and folding chairs. I even let a local wildlife photographer set up a blind near the north end to document the return of the herons. One Saturday, I found a small wooden box on my porch. No note. Inside, a hand-carved plaque. It was engraved with a single phrase, "Guardianship is earned." I mounted it to the dock that afternoon. The legacy Lorraine tried to build collapsed under its own lies, but something better rose in its place. Not just a neighborhood, but a community. One where trust was earned, not enforced. One where no one could lock a gate just because they held a title. And the lake. It was finally free because someone stood up and said no, not just once, but every time it mattered.